Hello, everybody. Welcome to our first Thursday School Board U webinar at Vermont School Boards Association. We're really glad that you're here tonight. This is a particularly topical program tonight because most of you are heading into reorganization meetings, and that includes, of course, the election of your board chair. I'm guessing many of you are already board chairs. I'm hoping some of you are thinking about becoming board chairs. And even if neither of those applies, as a board member, it's good to know what the chair's job is before you have to elect one. So with all of that said, before we get started in content, let's just review the ground rules and how things go tonight. I am Susan Holson. I'm Director of Education Services at VSBA, joined tonight by Sue Siglowski, the Director of Legal and Policy Services.
Good evening, everyone. Yes, I'm here.
Okay, and Carrie Lamb, our Director of Operations.
Good evening.
Okay, so if you have any technical difficulties, please call either one of those numbers during the broadcast. Those will ring right into our offices, and Carrie will jump on the phone and talk to you and try and walk you through whatever the issues are. Okay. So for those of you who have not yet attended any of our webinars, this is our basic format. We will be broadcasting a PowerPoint presentation, and we have everybody muted, which means if you have a question, please use the question box that is part of this app. Type it in at any time. We may or may not address them right as they come up. We've left some gaps in the content to make sure that we have time to get to all of them. And we have also received a few questions ahead of time by email, and we'll address those at the appropriate times throughout the evening. When we wrap this up and you sign out of here, you will be presented with a link for an evaluation, and it's very brief. I think it's 3, maybe 4 questions. We would very much appreciate your taking a moment to fill that out so that we can make sure the content that we're providing and the presentations that we're doing are speaking to our members' needs. Finally, we'll be following up today's presentation with an email early next week, which will provide you with a copy of the slides, a link to the video, which will have the audio, of course, and any summary information or incidental additional handouts that come up in the course of our conversation tonight. So with that all said, let's get started. The first question is to figure out what is it that school board chairs really need to do, and that's the crux of this evening. We've spent a lot of time considering this question and also surveying our members, and we think through time we have created a model to identify what makes a board chair effective. There are 4 major functions, each of which really needs some focus, and we'll go through each of them tonight. So the first key role of the chair is leadership. There are 2 big pieces of this. One is that you are building a team that understands its role, and also that it is performing the essential work necessary for school boards in Vermont. So what does that look like? Well, boards are made up of individuals who come from really different backgrounds, different philosophies, and different stances on and history with public education. In my experience, all new board members come in with some sort of an agenda. Otherwise, why would they run? And so your task as the chair is to help maximize their strengths and skills and minimize their liabilities to make them a good team member. Sometimes those personal agendas fall into place once they get grasp of what the board does and how it works, and sometimes they need to be reminded of some of the basics of being a board member. Every once in a while, you may encounter a problematic board member who either is really vigilant in their personal agenda or refuses to become part of the team or doesn't like some of the way the business is conducted. Most will join if they're engaged. And we'll talk more about the problematic behaviors in a little while. So the board has to play its proper role. And there are really 4 things that a board member needs to understand and needs to embrace. The first is that the role that we are hired to do by our electorate is that of trustee, which means we're serving on behalf of the community to be their eyes and ears around public education and make sure that the system is being overseen effectively. The chair needs to reinforce this role and should encourage all new board members to really grasp all of this. I'm going to put in a little shameless plug here. We are doing a School Board U Live Essential Work of Vermont School Board seminar on June 1st in Barre. It's a full day. It's going to be designed for both new board members and veteran board members, a great opportunity to get a refresher. And the feedback that we get often on these things is that it's great for a whole board to attend together. So I encourage you to plant that seed. Other than that, the role of the board is simple. Not so simple, but basic things are that you need to ensure high quality education for all your students, ensure that your public is getting a good return on the investment that it's making in public education, and make sure that the system is operating effectively, ethically, and Sue will want me to put in there legally. So great. How about a supervisory union? Where does this all fit in? Well, you need to, if you are the chair of an SU board, then you have a different lens. You're overseeing education for the whole region through the SU, but essentially it's still oversight of a system, as different SUs have different services that are centralized and allocated out in different ways. You know how your system is set up, and again, your goal is really to make sure that we're getting the best for our students. You need to be really upfront about that. By the way, my little superhero thing tonight is building on the board appreciation, board recognition in January being a darn tough job. I think board chairs are superheroes. So with that said, do we have any questions? Nothing coming in yet, Karen?
I do not see any at this point, so Susan.
Okay. Well, please, feel free to type in questions as they occur to you as we continue on then. So the second major role of the board chair is the partnership that the board has with the administration, primarily the superintendent. The board chair is really the conduit for setting the stage for that, and also the primary contact point. So a strong connection with the administration, working toward a common vision with a strong sense of teamwork. And we'll talk more, not so much tonight, but at other times we've talked a lot about building that common vision. And of course, it's important that the chair and the whole board and the superintendent all buy in. So as chair, you don't actually carry any more authority than anyone else. You're a board member, but you do have responsibility for promoting effective operations, and that can be very challenging. In most instances, as I said, you're the primary conduit between the board and the superintendent, so you need to make sure that the collaboration is working, that you have good communication between the board and the superintendent, and that together you're working forward, looking ahead, and working together as a team. When problems arise, you play a strong role in communicating about those issues and in solving them. So if there are severe problems, you're the only one who seeks assistance through your district attorney if necessary. Come to us at the VSBA if we can help you. That's what we're here for. Or some other resource. It may be the Agency of Education or the League of Cities and Towns. There are a lot of resources in the state. And hopefully that's a really rare thing and you won't have to worry about that too often. Vermont's governance system is very complicated and it can be confusing. So don't get bogged down in that confusion and prohibit high functioning of your board. Make sure you understand it. The legal structure is that the board provides oversight together with leadership, meaning administration, sets the vision and policy and secures resources, engages the community, and assures system accountability. And they also hire the superintendent, right? So the superintendent, by state statute, is the chief operating officer for the supervisory union and all of the member districts within that SU. And this is where it gets a little complicated. If you are in an SU structure, the superintendent is accountable to the SU board and to the member boards, which is why things have to really be functional. And the board supports the superintendent in the hiring of principals. The principal is the educational leader of a school in most cases, but works for the superintendent, not directly for the board. So there needs to be a good communication and good relationship between the principal and the superintendent. The principal and the board really don't have an interface that is critical to their respective roles. Tips from experienced school board chairs for working with the superintendent include some of these. Work closely with the superintendent to coordinate the work of the board with the work of the district administration. Consider regular information sharing sessions with your administrator, like maybe a monthly breakfast or lunch or coffee. Always go in assuming the best and keep an open mind, which sometimes is hard to do if you're in the midst of something that's a little contentious. In terms of your relations with the superintendent, ask for things, don't demand them, and listen to what they're telling you and try hard to understand. Ask questions, get clarifications. Be prepared to integrate the superintendent's ideas with your own and those of the rest of the board. And that's where the job of chair is particularly challenging and interesting, because bringing different ideas from different sources together and trying to put them all together to create action can be very complicated. Encourage your superintendent to come to you, the board chair, with any problems, and then assure him or her that you'll keep the confidence. And again, you know, I when I was very young, early in my career, when I gave notice at a job, I had a boss who asked me why I hadn't come to him sooner, and the thought had never crossed my mind because he was actually the problem. So having that kind of confidential relationship with the superintendent, if you can get there, that's going to set you up for success. Work with your superintendent to select the best time and method to share confidential information with the board. That can be tricky in the context of open meeting laws, so make sure you're well-versed there. Tell the board how you and the superintendent plan to work together and how that relationship will enhance the work of the board. You're not at odds with your administration. You're on the same team. The end result, of course, being what's best for kids in your district. And finally, work with the board and the superintendent to determine how they'll share different kinds of information and to make sure the rest of the board doesn't feel excluded from your relationship with the superintendent. So you're the primary point of contact, but you're only representing the board. Individual members are part of the dialogue, need to be part of the dialogue. Okay, I'll ask again questions at this point. Questions about that relationship between the board, the chair, and the superintendent?
Yes, we have a few questions.
Okay.
Jennifer would like to know, does it make sense for the board chair to also be the representative to the SU, or can these two roles be split?
Sue, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe anything is mandated in that regard. Generally speaking, though, the board chair of a district board is the filter for which all the information gets disseminated to the board. So in my experience, it's been helpful that the board chair serves on the SU board. It gives them a different perspective that they then can bring back into their leadership of a district board. Carrie it.
I have another question.
Okay.
From Maureen, she said, the board also oversees the superintendent, right? How to balance strong connection with management role.
You mean a personal connection. Well, you are a team, and at the end of the day, the board or some committee of the board participates, hopefully, in an annual evaluation of the superintendent. If there's a really strong personal bond, it might make sense to not be on that committee. But as long as you maintain your professional affiliation with one another, and the information that you're getting from central office gets shared with the rest of the board, I'm not sure I see a conflict there.
Okay, I have another question.
Yeah.
From Maureen, how would we know if the superintendent and principal have a good relationship? And does that matter?
You're asking some good ones there, Maureen. I think what matters from the board's perspective is performance of the system. So the superintendent is responsible for managing the principals, and the principals report to the superintendent. He or she is their boss. So it's incumbent on them to make sure that that working relationship is solid and that the results that are coming from that relationship are in fact advancing the vision of the system and the work of the board. So I guess the short answer is, of course it matters that they have a good relationship, but it's not a board issue.
Okay, I have one more question from Sarah.
Okay.
It sounds like the chair should have a closer working relationship with the superintendent than with the principal. Is that correct?
Absolutely. The board chair really, by rights, wouldn't have a relationship with the principal because the principal is the educational authority, and the board's role is not the building level mechanics of education. The board's role is oversight and vision, big picture. That's not executed. Well, the implementation of that is executed at the schools, but it's the superintendent's job to manage that.
Okay, that's all we have right now.
All right. Sue, you ready?
I am.
Okay.
One of the key roles of the board chair is organizing and conducting productive meetings. Board meetings are how the board takes action to accomplish its goals, and it's the chair's responsibility to ensure the meetings are productive, inclusive, and lawful. There are 5 components that are key to conducting productive, inclusive, and lawful meetings. In addition to the information I'm about to share with you, the VSBA has compiled a series of tools and structures that will support you to accomplish each of these tasks. All of these resources are available in the Essentials Guide.
And if I can just jump in for a second, we are about to go to the printer with a new updated version of the Essentials Workbook, the purple book, which will not be purple anymore. And also, I hope you're all familiar with the toolkit on our website, the Essential Work of School Boards, which has a lot of resources there for you.
Thank you, Susan.
Sure.
Could you go back to the previous slide for just a moment?
Sure, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to, thank you. So the ways to manage productive meetings include building an effective agenda, following Robert's Rules of Order, obeying open meeting and public records laws, facilitating complex community conversations, and striving for consensus. On the next slide, we talk specifically about building an effective agenda. The best way to build an effective agenda is to collaborate with your superintendent and to make sure that that agenda is aligned with your board goals. It should include a manageable number of issues so that each item can be given necessary consideration and so that meetings can be kept to a reasonable length. It should limit action to items that the board has had time to consider and ensure clarity so the public can be reasonably informed by looking at your agenda what the topics are that you are going to be discussing at the meeting. There are different types of items that you can have on an agenda. Discussion items cover issues that the board needs to discuss and deliberate, but upon which no action is going to be taken at that meeting. And we recommend that these items are early in the agenda while board members are fresh and alert. Action items are another type of item, and those are issues that require the board to make a decision by vote. They may have to be discussed over several meetings prior to this point. Consent items are routine matters that need no discussion by the board, but they do require board approval. They are grouped together as a single agenda item. And information items are just that. They're matters that the board needs to know about, but for which there's no board action needed. The information flow normally is one way from a presenter to the board, providing information to the board. The board chair should become familiar with Robert's Rules because state law requires school board meetings to be conducted in accordance with Robert's Rules of Order. Robert's Rules were designed to bring order to the chaos of meetings. The complete rule book, which is now 669 pages long, has content in it that has built up over time as questions of procedure arise. But don't worry that the average chair doesn't have to know about all of this in order to be able to function effectively at most meetings or even chair one meeting. If you know the basics of Robert's Rules, you've got a good start. There is Robert's Rules in Brief, which is 88 pages long and contains information that you'll most likely need to access. And if you'd like an even more abbreviated version, the VSBA Essential Work Guide, which, as Susan said, will be coming out soon, also has a chart of motions and the restrictions that apply to each motion. Questions that need to be addressed with Robert's Rules typically come up when a topic being debated is contentious. So we advise chairs to brush up on their Robert's Rules before a meeting if they know that there's something that's going to be coming up and occurring at a meeting that might require them to use Robert's Rules. If there is a question that comes up or a point of order is raised and you as a chair feel you're not quite sure what to do, there is nothing wrong with taking a recess during the meeting in order to consult the rules and figure out what's the best move. Another good resource is robertsrules.com, which has a question and answer forum, and it also has a list of frequently asked questions. And now we'll move on to open meeting and public records laws.
Before we do, Sue, can you just say two words about Robert's Rules for Small Boards? Because I think that can apply to a lot of our boards.
Yes. Robert's Rules for Small Boards is something that a board can adopt if it chooses to do so. Normally, Robert's Rules for Small Boards is for boards of 12 people or less. I think in the context of a school board, it can be difficult for even a board of that large to operate under Robert's Rules for Small Boards because they're much less formal than the regular Robert's Rules. For instance, members are not required to obtain the floor before making motions, and motions don't need to be seconded. There's no limit to the number of times a member can speak to a question, and there's also that the chair can make motions and usually votes on all questions. So it's quite different and it can be a little harder to follow exactly what decisions are being made and to take really good minutes without having the structure and order of the regular Robert's Rules.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We do also actually have a question. Would you like to take it now, or would you like to?
I can take it now.
Okay, it's from Jim. He says, while the board and chair should not be involved in any big way below the level of the superintendent, a board should have some good sense of smooth operation of the system below the superintendent. How can one balance not micromanaging with knowing that the system is functioning well?
I'll take a stab at that one. The board's job is to know that the system is producing outcomes, and the functionality is implicit in achieving the outcomes. So I'm not sure that I would agree that the board needs to see the functionality of the school in terms of operations. Has that addressed your question, Jim?
Jessica asks, what do you mean by outcomes in that?
Well, the board should have stated goals for the district and for the board itself. And the outcomes would be measuring those, measuring progress on those goals. The evidence can vary from the number of students who, well, from graduation rates to the number of students who are involved in co-curricular activities to test scores, and well beyond those. So there's a broad array of ways to collect data to assess progress toward goals.
Okay, seems to have answered the questions.
Great.
Thank you. I will move on to talk about open meeting law and public records law. School boards are public bodies and they are subject to Vermont open meeting law. And this means that all school board meetings, including meetings of committees and also subcommittees, must be open to the public. The public must be given notice and a reasonable opportunity to be heard. The amount and type of notice depends on the type of meeting held, and this information is included in the Essentials Guide. Board members should have school district email addresses to keep district business communications separate. All emails among board members can be subjected to an open records request. Do not put anything in writing, including text message, that you would not want to see on the front page of the newspaper. And in the slide, you can see the statutory references to the open meeting law that states that all meetings are open to the public. Any person can inspect or copy any public record of a public agency, which would include a board. And a public record is any written or recorded information, regardless of the physical form, that is produced or acquired in the course of public agency business. Another important part of running meetings is making sure that the board follows the executive session requirements, which are on the next slide. Boards must first meet in public session and then vote to enter executive session by a motion that indicates the nature of the business to be discussed. And the Essentials Guide also covers executive session. A board can go into executive session to cover the following only if they have a finding that premature general public knowledge would clearly place the board or a person involved at a substantial disadvantage. So those areas are consideration of contracts, labor relations agreements, arbitration, mediation, grievances, litigation to which the board is or may be a party, and confidential attorney-client communications. There are some other permissible reasons to go into executive session that don't require that finding of premature general public knowledge. And those are the negotiating or securing of real estate purchase options, the employment or evaluation of an employee, a disciplinary action against an employee, except if such an employee seeks a public hearing after formal charges are brought, a clear and imminent peril to public safety, discussion or consideration of records or documents that are not public documents under the Access to Public Records Act, and the academic records or suspension or discipline of students. And the other area is school security or emergency response measures, the disclosure of which could jeopardize public safety. So those are the permissible reasons for entering executive session. They're listed in 1 VSA section 313, and you cannot go into executive session for any other reason. When boards do go into executive session, they may invite their attorney, they can invite administrative staff or anybody else who is a subject of the discussion or who can provide them information that they need in order to discuss the matter at hand. No binding action can be made while in executive session, and so the ultimate action must be made by taking a motion and voted in open session.
And as far as public participation at your meetings, the public can and should have a voice in what the board is up to, but no person or group of people have the right to disrupt your meetings. So I think it's really important to remember that board meetings are public meetings. They're open meetings, as Sue just described, but they're not meetings of the public, which means that it's not the board is there to do its work. It's not there to have dialogue with community members on issues that are either discussion items or action items. You're certainly encouraged to hear people out, but not to engage with them at the meeting. The chair needs to ensure that the public feels welcome at their meetings, at your meetings, but also make sure that you're staying focused on your agenda and the work of the board. So it's customary that boards would adopt a policy or at least a practice that allows citizens to speak at your meetings, but perhaps establish time constraints before board action is taken. So maybe you're going to limit that each person has a specific amount of time available. Maybe you're also going to limit the number of times people can speak. And as long as you're clear and consistent about that, especially if you know that a contentious topic is coming up, then you are fulfilling your responsibility to have the input from the public. And this gets tricky because, of course, for most of us, these are our friends and neighbors that we're talking about, right? And this goes back to the question about the congenial relationship with the superintendent. So the situations that present themselves are rarely cut and dried, which is why it's so important to have a public comment policy in place and well-established practices. As chair, then, you know what to do, and the public knows what to expect. And both of those are really important so that the process can maintain integrity and that the board can continue to do the work that the board has to work. The VSBA Model Policy Manual, which is available on our website, contains a model policy on public participation at board meetings. And you may have a policy that's similar or even identical to that one, or you may have something different, but it is really important to have that policy in place. As chair, one of your goals is to try to come up with consensus on action items. And consensus doesn't mean blanket agreement to everything. It means that after hearing each other and listening to each other, people are able to come to a point where they can sign off. It may still not be their preferred resolution, but at least they consider it to be a workable solution. Consensus is more about listening than talking. And when you're facilitating a board discussion on an action item, the chair's job is to make sure that different viewpoints are heard and explored, that people are asking questions and not arguing with each other. You're going to try and intervene by looking for points of similarity and to allow differences of opinion to recognize good points on each side. So urge people to focus on the interest, what it is that's important to them, and not so much their position, because then you can find those commonalities. So explore the reasons for agreement and try to get at least alignment, even if you can't get full agreement from everybody on everything, which is fundamentally impossible. So are there questions about the meetings and the laws around the meetings or anything else?
There's not around the meetings, but there is one that goes back to our last question section from Maureen. She asks outcomes. She said outcomes and goals are likely going to be long-term. If you have a problem in your school, it won't show up until much later and possibly too late to address. I'm not sure I understand Sue's answer, and I believe this goes back to looking at the long-term goals and if they're being met as to what's going on in your school.
So if the issue that is cropping up is operational, then it really is not in the board's purview. Running the schools is the job of the administration. If the issue is affecting students directly in a comprehensive way, so it's a systemic issue, then I would agree the board would get involved in that. Does that make sense, Maureen?
Okay, I have another question from Sarah. She said, are letters to the board from community members, parents, etc. considered public? Should they be attached to the minutes and or made available to the public?
Letters to the board are public documents. They should be referenced at the board meeting. I don't know that you would attach them to the minutes, but you certainly could do that.
Okay, oh, we have one more just pop up from Allison. Are subcommittees without a quorum subject to open meeting law?
If a subcommittee is meeting and it's not a quorum, then it would not be considered a what is defined as a meeting under the open meeting law. So they really wouldn't be having a meeting if they didn't have a quorum. And they wouldn't be able to make any decisions.
Well, generally speaking, Sue, correct me if I'm wrong, but board committees are really designed to provide information to the full board to take action.
Correct.
Okay, so there
Yes.
wouldn't likely be action items for a committee.
Well, a committee still could, they need to come to a decision on what their recommendation will be to the board. So they really can't take action on that without a quorum present.
Okay, that's all the questions we have right now.
Okay.
Thank you. Next, we'll move on to the key role of the board chair in promoting lawful and ethical operation of the board. On the next slide, we have provided some guidelines for lawful and ethical operations. And those include that board members should be clear that they don't have individual power to make decisions outside of the board. It's very important for all board members to know that they need to maintain the confidentiality of executive session, and that the board's role is, as Susan has spoken to earlier, to assure that the schools are well run, but not to run the schools. Board members, of course, should avoid even the perception of a conflict of interest, and they need to recognize that majority rules and accept the validity of board decisions, even if they don't agree with the decision. One of the ways to ensure ethical operations is to establish a code of ethics. VSBA's Essential Work Toolkit contains a model code of ethics for Vermont school board members, and we're going to include that in the handouts, which will be emailed to you, everyone who signed up for the webinar. The model code of ethics includes sections and more details on board members acting within the scope of their official role, upholding the highest ethical standards, respecting their peers, constituents, and also respecting the confidentiality considerations.
Generally speaking, we recommend that every board member sign that code of ethics every year, and that you keep them available for the public to see. At a minimum, you want people to sign them every time they're reelected or elected for the first time. While we're on the subject, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Susan.
No.
In addition to the code of ethics, every board has to have a conflict of interest policy, and that is required by law. VSBA's policy manual contains a model board member conflict of interest policy, and in that policy, it requires board members to be aware of when they have a conflict or the appearance of a conflict, and to actually declare the nature and the extent of the conflict for inclusion in the board minutes, and then abstain from voting or participating in the discussion of the issue that gave rise to the conflict. And there's also a process in that model policy for someone else to identify a conflict. So when there is a conflict and the board member, him or herself, does not identify it, it can be identified by another board member or a member of the public, and the board would then hold an informal hearing giving both parties an opportunity to be heard. And the other board members would determine by majority vote whether the charge is supported by the evidence, and if so, what other steps should be taken in response.
I'm going to backtrack a little bit because we glossed over, as I said, Paul had sent some emailed questions and we want to address them at this point. The first question that he asked is, what can the board chair do to other board members when they act out of line? Is there any type of censure or procedure to remove the elected official similar to what is found in the legislature? And he gave us a little bit of context, which I'll summarize here. There was one board member who was acting unprofessionally, particularly in executive session, swearing and verbally abusing, even threatening the superintendent. It was also discovered that that same board member had lied to the rest of the board to influence the board's vote on an action item to promote his own agenda. And finally, there were multiple violations of board protocols and procedures. When the board chair talked to this board member to call out the behavior, it actually accelerated and got worse and went from being seen primarily in executive session to the public open meeting. So Sue, can you address that whole question of, for lack of a better term, discipline and censure?
Sure. So the board chair took what I would recommend to be the first step in that case, is meeting with the board member in private to discuss the problematic behavior. And sounds like that did not take care of the problem. So I'm going to go into some other tools that can be used in the board meeting to manage the situation. So in addition to meeting with the board member, there are tools the board chair can use to keep a positive tone. And one tool is a board agreement that all members sign, the Code of Ethics, which we just talked about. Another tool is approval of operating norms at the board's organizational meeting. And those are, ideas that the board members brainstorm and agree to. And one way to keep those front and center is to read the norms at the beginning of each meeting. That helps to set the tone of the meeting for the board members and for members of the public that are attending the meeting. If a board member's behavior is not within the Code of Ethics or the operating norms, the chair can correct the board member using Robert's Rules of Order. For example, if the board member is interrupting another board member, the chair could say, Mary has the floor at this time. Interruptions are not allowed under Robert's Rules of Order. Please wait until being recognized by the chair before speaking. If you have a situation where one board member attacks another board member, the chair could say, under our rules of order, personal attacks are not allowed. I am reminding all members to observe the rules of our board and show courtesy and respect to one another at all times. But if this behavior continues and it is a pattern, the board can go into executive session to discuss the matter with the board member under 1 VSA section 313 subsection A4. Hopefully this discussion will lead to courteous and respectful behavior. At that point, if it does not, the board really should consult with its attorney about whether censure of the board member is appropriate. It's very important to consult with the board's attorney because you need to, first of all, determine whether it's appropriate and also what is the appropriate process to use. So to follow this all the way through to the end, it could lead to public censure of a board member during a meeting, which should be reflected in the minutes. But hopefully by employing some of the tools that I spoke about earlier, you would not need to get to that point.
But there is no way in the statutes to remove a board member from a board. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So the second question that Paul sent in relates to what a board chair can do if an elected official, in this case it was the district clerk who's elected at the annual meeting by the public, if that officer is not performing his duties. What is the recourse for the chair?
There isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to that question. It's really going to depend on the office in question and the particular facts of the situation. So in that case, we would recommend that the board consult with its attorney.
Okay. So are there more questions about the legal aspects, the ethical aspects, operational things, anything really, open-ended, anything that comes to your mind?
We do actually have a few.
Great.
Angelique, I believe her name is, asks, are there ever times when a chair should share language of the board's position with the board before publicly commenting on an issue to the press or to press, front porch forum, etc.?
So the board chair is often, I guess probably usually, the designated voice of the board for media concerns. If there is it's just courtesy, I think, that the board chair would share whatever message is going out there on behalf of the board with the other board members. If not beforehand, if that's not practical, then pretty much at the same time. Nobody likes to be blindsided or surprised. A lot of media will attempt to call every board member and get their opinion on something. The protocol there would be that they would refer the reporter to the designated spokesperson, but they ought to know what's going on. The specific wording of it, probably not, unless there's an opportunity.
Okay, are we ready for the next question?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, from Cynthia. Can you clarify the quorum question about committees? My understanding is that the committees are subject to open meeting law. The quorum question relates to a quorum of the committee, not a quorum of the board, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, so she says, my understanding is that the committees are subject to open meeting law. So,
yes. Committees are subject to open meeting law.
but it's an open meeting of the board members present, not of the committee members present.
I'm not quite understanding the question. I think, is she referring to a committee that has more than just board members on it?
I'm assuming that she's referring to like the policy committee that might have 5 community members and 2 board members and a 5-member board. Do they need to take minutes?
Yes, they need to take minutes. They need to warn their meetings just the same way that a board warns their meetings, and they need to take minutes of their meetings.
Even if there's not a majority of the board present, correct?
Correct. Yes.
And it's always a good idea, because there could be a majority that arrive. You don't know who's going to arrive beforehand. Okay, so the next question comes from Maureen regarding the discipline issue in executive session. Sue mentions calling executive session under 313 subsection A4. What is the reason stated for the executive session?
I'm pulling out my green book, which is a helpful book for board chairs to have, I should mention. It's called the Vermont Education Law Book. It's published every year. Right now I'm looking at the 2018 edition. And the 313A4 is a disciplinary or dismissal action against a public officer or employee. So it could be stated, the reason for going into executive session could be stated as a disciplinary action against a public officer.
Okay, next question from Jeff. What documents provided to the board at a meeting need to be shared with the public?
All of the documents provided to the board at a meeting should be, if they're requested, should be shared with the public, except for documents that are reviewed in executive session and that are not considered to be public records.
Okay, I think we answered this question for Sarah. She said, what if the committee is made up of more than just board members? But we said that the meeting should always be warned, even if it's board members and committee members.
Yes.
Okay, I think that's all of our questions.
Okay. So, whoops. We just want to remind you that in addition to our phone numbers, we do have other resources for you. We've pulled together a lot of tools and supports for board chairs in the board chair toolkit on our website. There are links there to a lot of the documentation that we were talking about today, a lot of the model policies, some protocols, and I will also, when we send out the packet to, it's an email packet to each of you with the video and the slides from this evening, Sue had mentioned we're going to include a model code of conduct, will also include in their model operating protocols. But all of that is available on the website. And there's also a toolkit there that gives guidelines and support for your reorganizational meeting, which for most boards is coming up in most likely your next meeting, with most school board members being elected on town meeting day. So some of the specific legal technical things that need to happen at that meeting, it's a good review for board chairs. Sue, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think you've covered it.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up then. We thank you very much for being the superheroes that you are and for joining us this evening, and for your commitment to all our kids. Please, when you leave the webinar, do take that evaluation and let us know, give us your feedback. And just as a reminder, in case you don't already know it, this is the VSBA staff. We are here to support you, our members. So thank you very much, and we will see you on the next first Thursday, if not before.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.